It was supposed to be just another ordinary night at work. I had flown hundreds of night flights in my career. I knew what to expect. Long hours of silence, the gentle purr of the engines, total control of the aircraft in my experienced hands. That night, the route would be from London to Athens, a route I had taken several times before. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary, but I didn't know that that flight would change my life forever. It all started at the routine briefing, hours before takeoff. The crew was in good spirits, all excited for what appeared to be a smooth trip. The weather was calm, with no storms in sight, and the route was perfect. However, there was an uncomfortable feeling in the back of my mind, something I couldn't explain. It was as if an invisible cloud was hanging over us, a shadow we couldn't ignore. I kept it to myself. As captain, my duty was to stay calm and make sure everyone was safe. But that feeling wouldn't go away. As we got to the plane, things started to seem even stranger. The Airbus A320, a robust and reliable aircraft, felt cooler than usual. I'm not talking about temperature, but about the atmosphere. The lights seemed dimmer, the hallways darker, and the air felt heavier, almost as if there was something inside the cabin that we couldn't see. Still, we continued. The passengers boarded and I did my security check. Everything seemed to be in order, and there was no apparent reason to cancel the flight. Then, we continued with the takeoff procedures. We took off into the London night sky at around 10:30 p.m. The city, lit up like a vast ocean of twinkling lights, stretched out below us as the aircraft was enveloped in the deep darkness of night. Up there, the world seemed calm. Air traffic control flowed smoothly, and communications were crystal clear. It was an absolutely ordinary night, or at least so I thought. About 45 minutes after takeoff, we were well above the clouds, sailing at a calm altitude, when something unexpected happened. The first officer sitting next to me turned abruptly, with a perplexed expression on his face. "Captain, did you hear that?" he asked, the tension in his voice clear. "Hear what?" I replied, slightly confused. Other than the constant comforting hum of the engines, there was no other sound. He hesitated, his eyes fixed on the controls. I swear I heard a voice, like someone talking on the radio. But the frequencies are clear. That statement worried me. I checked the communication instruments again. Everything was normal. No interference, no nearby aircraft, no strange communications from the tower. Still, something inside me became alert, as if an invisible shadow had approached. I had already felt this sensation before we left, an indescribable restlessness. Minutes later, the inexplicable happened again. This time I heard it myself. It was a subtle sound, a distant voice, like a whisper in the darkness, almost imperceptible. It seemed to come from the radio, but when I tried to adjust the frequencies, the sound disappeared as quickly as it appeared. I turned to the first officer, and I could see the discomfort in his eyes. "Maybe it's just static," I suggested, trying to remain calm and in control of the situation. However, deep down, I knew this wasn't just static. Something else was happening, something we couldn't understand. And that feeling, the same one I felt before we took off, was now growing, hanging over us like an invisible but undeniable threat. Minutes later, the feeling of restlessness grew, washing over me with a disconcerting intensity. The radio remained completely silent, but it was as if I could feel, with every fiber of my being, that someone was trying to communicate with us. It wasn't something tangible. It was a strange perception, as if an invisible presence had entered the cockpit. The light from the instruments, always so reliable, now seemed dimmer, almost flickering. Suddenly, the temperature in the cabin plummeted, cold as ice, despite all the controls being perfectly adjusted. I turned to the first officer, and his face was pale, as if he had seen a ghost. "Captain, what's happening?" he asked, his voice trembling and full of fear. Before I could respond, the voice returned, this time clearer than anything else on the plane. "Help us. Please. We are trapped." The words echoed through the cockpit, desperate and haunting, sounding almost inhuman. It came clearly over the radio, but when I looked at the communications panel again, everything was in order. There were no other planes on our route, and the control tower in Athens had not yet made contact. My mind started spinning with impossible questions and possibilities. What was happening? Who was that voice? We were crossing the Mediterranean, and according to all the data, there were no other aircraft nearby. Even so, that cry for help gave me deep chills. I tried to respond on the radio, but what came back was just low, ominous static. I looked at the first officer, and the terror in his eyes was evident. He had heard it too. Trying to maintain my composure, I sent a verification request to the control tower. Athens' response came quickly and precisely. No air traffic nearby, no anomalies detected, nothing out of the ordinary. However, everything around us felt deeply wrong. I was beginning to question my own sanity. Could it be possible that we were hearing something that did not belong to this world? A communication from somewhere or some time that we were not supposed to reach? It was then that the cabin lights began to flicker, as if something was directly interfering with the aircraft's electrical system. The plane shook slightly, a subtle but unsettling movement, especially since the weather radar indicated no turbulence ahead. It was as if some invisible force was playing with our senses, distorting the environment around us. Despite this, the passengers still seemed oblivious to the situation, but I noticed that the crew was beginning to exchange suspicious glances. Moments later, a flight attendant entered the cockpit with a worried expression. He asked if there was any problem, as some passengers were beginning to notice the sudden changes in lighting. I tried to remain calm, adopting a reassuring tone. "Everything is under control," I told him. "It could just be a temporary glitch in the lighting system." But deep down, I knew that this was not a simple, technical defect. There was something else going on, something much more disturbing. As soon as the flight attendant left the cockpit, the voice returned. "We are here. Please meet us." This time, the whisper was accompanied by clear interference with the navigation systems. The radar, until then perfectly functional, began to display echoes that simply didn't make sense. Dots began to appear on the screen, as if other aircraft were surrounding us. I checked again with air traffic control, but there was no one else in the vicinity. The sky was completely empty, and we were over 30,000 feet high, in the middle of nowhere. Yet the echoes continued, flickering across the screen like invisible ghosts, and then, without warning, everything went dark. All the cockpit screens went dark, plunging us into an oppressive silence, broken only by the distant hum of the engines. It was as if the plane itself was being consumed by an unknown force, and at that moment I knew we were facing something far beyond our understanding, something that perhaps neither time nor physics could explain. The cockpit was plunged into total darkness. Only the constant, monotonous sound of the engines filled the oppressive silence. My mind worked frantically, trying to understand what was happening. It was as if the plane was being controlled by a force beyond our understanding. The radio chirped again, and this time the voice was different, more serious, loaded with a sinister threat. "You shouldn't be here. This flight should never have happened." My hands were sweaty and shaking as I desperately tried to restart the aircraft systems. The first officer, in a panic, pressed buttons and turned switches, trying to regain some control, but nothing seemed to work. The darkness inside the cockpit was palpable, suffocating. I could feel a presence around us, something I couldn't see but was there, watching, waiting. Then, like a miracle, the lights came on again. The radar is back to normal. All systems were working perfectly, as if nothing had happened. However, the feeling that something was wrong never left me. I knew we were not alone. The rest of the flight turned into a psychological nightmare. The silence between me and the first officer was almost deafening. We both knew that something inexplicable had touched us that night, something that transcended the boundaries of reality as we know it. When we finally landed in Athens, I felt like my perception of reality had become irrevocably distorted. As I got off the plane, I looked up at the night sky. A disconcerting feeling told me that what we experienced that night was not over. And I was right.